Welcome, dear listeners, to a night of terror and horror. Tonight, we bring you not one, not two, but three bone-chilling stories of being home alone. These tales will make your heart race, your palms sweat, and your mind spin with fear. As you settle in for the night, prepare yourself for the unexpected. You may think you know what lurks in the shadows, but these stories will test the limits of your imagination. And who knows, you may even start to feel like you're not so alone after all. So without further ado, we present to you Mr. Horror, a master of suspense and the architect of your nightmares. He will guide you through these tales of terror, so keep your wits about you and brace yourself for a night you'll never forget. It was a dark and stormy night, and 17-year-old Emily was home alone. Her parents were out of town for the weekend, leaving her to fend for herself in their old, creaky house in the woods. Emily had always been a little creeped out by the house, with its strange noises and spooky attic, but she tried not to let it get to her. As she settled in for the night, Emily heard a faint tapping on the window. She dismissed it as a branch blowing in the wind and tried to ignore it, but the tapping persisted, growing louder and more insistent. Finally, Emily got up to investigate. Peering out into the darkness, Emily could just make out a figure standing outside her window. She couldn't see their face, but she could sense their presence, and it sent shivers down her spine. She quickly closed the blinds and retreated back to her room, feeling more uneasy than ever. As she tried to settle back into bed, Emily heard a strange scratching sound coming from beneath the floorboards. It was soft at first, but it quickly grew louder and more frenzied, as if some creature was trying to claw its way up through the floor. Emily froze, too scared to move or make a sound, and prayed that it would stop soon. But the scratching continued, growing more and more intense, until finally it abruptly ceased. Emily lay there in the darkness, heart racing, unsure of what to do next. She knew she should call the police or a friend, but she couldn't bring herself to move. All she could do was wait and hope that whatever was out there wouldn't find a way in. As the hours ticked by, Emily remained huddled under her covers, listening intently for any signs of danger. She heard strange whispers and footsteps outside her door, and even thought she saw shadows moving in the corners of her room. But when she turned on the light, there was nothing there. Finally, as dawn began to break, Emily heard a loud crash coming from downstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen over, and Emily knew that she had to investigate. With a shaking hand, she grabbed a flashlight and slowly made her way down the stairs, bracing herself for whatever horrors lay ahead. To her relief, Emily found that the source of the noise was just a vase that had fallen over in the hallway. And as she bent down to pick it up, she noticed something strange etched into the wood floorboards. It was a set of mysterious symbols, arranged in a pattern that made her blood run cold. Emily knew that something sinister was at work in her house, and that she was not safe there alone. Emily's heart was racing as she stared at the symbols on the floor, trying to make sense of them. They were unlike anything she had ever seen before, intricate and ancient-looking, with strange shapes and lines that seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they held some kind of dark power, and she knew that she had to find out more. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily spent the next few hours poring over old books and online resources, trying to identify the symbols and their meaning. She found references to ancient cults and forbidden rituals, and even came across accounts of similar symbols being used in sacrificial ceremonies. Emily's mind raced with the possibilities, and she began to fear for her own safety. Just as she was about to give up hope, Emily stumbled upon a website dedicated to the paranormal. It was filled with stories of hauntings and demonic possession, and it offered a glimmer of hope that there might be someone out there who could help her. Emily quickly composed an email to the site's owner, begging for assistance and explaining her situation in detail. To her surprise, she received a response within minutes. The email was short and cryptic, but it promised to send someone to her house that evening to investigate. Emily didn't know what to make of it, but she clung to the hope that someone would be able to help her. As the evening approached, Emily's nerves were on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and she kept hearing strange noises coming from all around the house. But as the appointed hour arrived, there was a knock at the door, and Emily raced to answer it. Standing on her doorstep was a tall, thin man with piercing blue eyes and an air of authority. He introduced himself as Michael, a paranormal investigator, and quickly got to work examining the symbols on the floor. Emily watched nervously as he muttered incantations under his breath and performed strange rituals, trying to break whatever dark magic had taken hold of her house. As he worked, Michael explained that the symbols were part of an ancient ritual meant to summon a powerful demon. He said that the demon was attracted to places of great suffering and sorrow, and that it was likely drawn to Emily's house because of some traumatic event in its past. Emily was horrified by the thought, and she clung to Michael for comfort as he continued his work. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Michael stepped back and nodded in satisfaction. He said that the ritual had been broken and that the demon had been banished from the house. Emily breathed a sigh of relief, and for a moment she felt as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. But then she saw something move out of the corner of her eye, and she realized that it wasn't over yet. The shadows were creeping closer, and the air was thick with a palpable sense of malevolence. Emily knew that she had to get out of the house, and fast. She grabbed Michael's hand and pulled him towards the door, but as they stepped outside, they were met with a horrific sight. The ground was crawling with shadowy figures, their twisted forms reaching out to grab them. Emily screamed, and Michael pulled her back inside the house, slamming the door shut behind them. As they huddled together in the darkness, Emily realized that they were trapped. The demons had followed them inside, and they were now surrounded on all sides. Michael said that they would have to fight their way out, but Emily wasn't sure if she had the strength to do it. The demons were closing in, their twisted faces leering out of the darkness. Emily could feel their hot breath on her skin. Emily's heart was pounding in her chest as she stood in the darkness, surrounded by the demons. Michael was muttering incantations under his breath, but it seemed as if their efforts were useless. The demons were getting closer and closer, their twisted forms reaching out to grab them. Emily closed her eyes and tried to summon her courage. She thought of her family and friends and how much she wanted to survive this nightmare. She took a deep breath and prepared to fight. The demons were upon them, their twisted hands clawing at their flesh. Emily screamed as she felt their sharp nails scrape against her skin, but she fought back with all her might. She swung a lamp at one of the demons, and it shattered on impact. Michael was wielding a silver knife, and he slashed at the demons with wild abandon. For what seemed like hours, they fought back the demons. Emily's body was covered in bruises and cuts, but she refused to give up. Michael was panting and covered in sweat, but he kept fighting as if his life depended on it. Finally, with a final burst of energy, they were able to drive the demons back. They stumbled out into the daylight, gasping for breath and covered in blood. Emily collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her face as she realized that she had survived. Michael knelt beside her, a look of deep concern on his face. He said that the demons had been banished for good, but that the experience had taken a toll on both of them. He recommended that Emily seek therapy and take some time to recover from the trauma. Over the next few weeks, Emily did just that. She saw a therapist and tried to come to terms with what had happened. She also did some research on her own, trying to figure out what had caused the demons to appear in her house. What she found was shocking. It turned out that the house had been built on the site of an old mental institution where terrible things had happened in the past. Patients had been mistreated and abused, and many had died as a result. Emily realized that the trauma and suffering of those patients had somehow imprinted itself on the house, creating a dark energy that had attracted the demons. Armed with this knowledge, Emily decided to take action. She contacted local authorities and began a campaign to have the site of the old institution recognized as a historic landmark with a memorial dedicated to the victims of its abuses. She hoped that by doing so, she could help to honor the memories of those who had suffered and maybe even prevent something like this from happening again. Years later, Emily still lives in the same house, but it's different now. She's filled it with light and love, and she's made peace with the demons of her past. The symbols on the floor are gone, replaced by a bright and colorful rug. But sometimes, on quiet nights when she's alone, Emily can still feel a chill run down her spine, and she knows that the memory of those demons will never truly be gone. But she's learned to live with it, to embrace the darkness and find beauty in it, and in that way, she's triumphed over the horror that once haunted her home. Sophie had always enjoyed spending time alone in her family's secluded cabin in the woods. It was a peaceful retreat, a place where she could escape from the stress of her daily life and recharge her batteries. But one night, while her family was away on a trip, Sophie realized that being alone wasn't always so peaceful. It started with a sound. At first, she thought it was just a squirrel or a bird outside, but as the minutes ticked by, the noise grew louder and more insistent. It sounded like something was scratching at the walls, trying to get in. Sophie's heart began to race as she realized that she was truly alone, with no one to protect her from whatever was outside. She tried to stay calm, but as the scratching grew louder and more persistent, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of terror. Finally, unable to take it anymore, Sophie went to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made her way around the cabin, checking each window and door for signs of a break-in. But everything was locked up tight, and there were no footprints or other signs of anyone outside. As Sophie made her way back to her bedroom, she noticed something strange. The walls seemed to be pulsing and shifting, almost as if they were alive. She could hear a faint whispering sound, like voices murmuring just out of reach. Sophie froze in terror, unable to move as the whispering grew louder and more insistent. It was as if the walls were alive and they were trying to tell her something. But what? She tried to shake off the feeling and tell herself that it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew that something was terribly wrong. The cabin was no longer a peaceful retreat. It was a place of darkness and dread where anything could happen. Sophie spent the rest of the night in her bedroom, huddled under the covers, too scared to move. The whispering continued, a constant murmur in the background that she couldn't ignore. She tried to tell herself that it was just the wind or the creaking of the old cabin, but she knew deep down that it was something else entirely. As morning dawned, Sophie felt a sense of relief. The night had been long and terrifying, but she had made it through in one piece. She got up and tried to go about her day as usual, but the feeling of unease never left her. As the day wore on, Sophie began to notice other strange things. Objects seemed to be moving on their own. Doors would open and close without explanation, and she could hear footsteps echoing through the cabin even though she knew she was alone. Sophie tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left her. She felt like there was something in the cabin with her, something dark and malevolent that was just waiting for the right moment to strike. As night fell again, Sophie retreated to her bedroom, hoping to find some solace in sleep. But she was too scared to close her eyes, too scared to let her guard down. The whispering started up again, louder than ever, and she could feel a sense of malevolence in the air. And then, suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door. Sophie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could be knocking at the door in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere? She tried to ignore it, but the knocking grew louder and more insistent. It was as if someone was trying to break down the door. Sophie knew then that she was not alone, and that whatever was outside was not friendly. She clutched her blanket tightly to her chest and prayed for the morning to come quickly. Morning finally arrived, and Sophie stumbled out of bed, exhausted but relieved to have made it through the night. She cautiously made her way to the front door, bracing herself for whatever might be waiting on the other side. But when she opened the door, she found nothing. No one was there, no sign of a break-in or any other disturbance. It was as if the events of the night before had never happened. Sophie packed up her things and left the cabin that day, vowing never to return. She never spoke of the strange occurrences that had happened there, but she knew that something was waiting in the woods, something that was not meant to be disturbed. Years later, Sophie heard that the cabin had been torn down, replaced by a new structure. But she knew that the memories and the darkness that had haunted her there would never truly be gone. Karen had just moved into a new flat building, excited to start a new chapter in her life. But on her very first night, she was struck by an overwhelming feeling of unease. The flat felt colder than it should, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she settled into bed, Karen heard strange noises coming from the other side of the wall. It sounded like something scratching or tapping, but when she tried to investigate, there was nothing there. Karen tried to ignore the feeling of unease and the strange noises, chalking it up to the unfamiliarity of a new place. But as the night wore on, the noises grew louder and more persistent, and then, suddenly, they stopped. Karen lay in bed, her heart racing, wondering what could have caused the sudden silence. And then, just as she was about to close her eyes, she heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It was as if someone was speaking directly into her ear. But when she looked around the room, she was completely alone. Karen spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened anxiety, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched. The strange noises and whispers had unnerved her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows. The next morning, Karen tried to push the events of the previous night out of her mind, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. She tried to keep herself busy with unpacking and decorating, but the unease persisted. As the sun began to set, Karen found herself once again alone in the flat. She tried to distract herself with a book, but the scratching and tapping sounds began once again, louder than before. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. Karen sat frozen, waiting for the next sound, but there was nothing. Karen couldn't take it anymore. She knew she had to get out of the flat, if only for a little while. She grabbed her keys and headed out the door, not looking back. But as she made her way down the hallway, she heard the whisper again. It was clearer this time, and Karen could make out a single word: leave. Karen ran out of the building and never looked back. She never did find out what had been haunting her in that flat, but she knew she never wanted to be home alone there again. As Mr. Horror, I hope these 3 stories have left you feeling sufficiently spooked and unsettled. Remember, there's nothing quite as terrifying as being home alone with something that you can't explain. If you've ever experienced anything like the stories we've shared today, we want to hear about it. Leave a comment below and tell us your own tale of horror while home alone. Who knows, maybe your story will be the inspiration for our next set of bone-chilling tales. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to lock your doors tonight. You never know what might be lurking just beyond them.